Last week we started looking at the piyut of Unetanet Tokef, in particular the climax of Unetanet Tokef, Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Mavirin Edroa Hagezerah. And what we saw last week was that finding a source for a mitzvah of Teshuvah in the Torah is not as simple as one might have supposed, and that basically all of the psukim that speak about the action of Teshuvah are found in Sefer Dvarim. But the big issue that we have as far as all of those psukim is whether those psukim are in fact a command or a promise. That's one issue. As to whether they are time limited, and particularly as to whether when the Torah speaks about Teshuvah, whether it's talking about a specific set of actions that would constitute a process of repentance, such as vidui or charata, specific actions which would be its own mitzvah, or whether we were talking about whether the Torah is speaking about a more general return to keeping all of the mitzvot. And if when the Torah talks about v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, you'll return to Hashem, if that means just a general return to doing mitzvot, as the context might seem to imply, so then it would be hard to use this as a source for a specific action of Teshuvah. And we saw that was a machloket rishonim. We saw that in the Perush of Rabbi Yehuda Ibn Balam. So he quotes different opinions on that issue, and the majority opinion before the Rambam, the majority opinion within the Geonim, seems to be that Teshuvah is not counted as a mitzvah. And we saw that in the Rambam, we started looking at a small part of the sources on the Rambam, and we saw that within the Rambam's position, it's somewhat complicated. The Rambam does count a mitzvah, but he seems to combine vidui and Teshuvah together, and in fact, he formulates that the mitzvah is vidui when one does Teshuvah. And on the backdrop of what we saw last week, we could then understand what the Rambam is troubled by and why the Rambam is struggling so mightily, why he didn't just count a mitzvah of Teshuvah. And the answer is because it's not so simple that there is a mitzvah of Teshuvah. On the other hand, the Rambam creates a whole set of halachot called Hilchot Teshuvah. So the Rambam does some sort of compromise where he's counting the mitzvah of vidui as the mitzvah, but he attaches it to the process of Teshuvah, vidui when one does Teshuvah. Today what we're going to try to do is take a look at some of the sources, or possible sources, potential sources, for the line in the piyut of Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Mavirin Edroa Hagezerah. And we'll see that there's a couple of sources in particular that are important to us, a Bavli and a Yerushalmi. And we're going to try to compare and contrast the two sources to see how they relate to each other, and not just what's similar, but obviously what some of the important differences that they might reflect, and how that might play out in the development of our piyut of Unetanet Tokef and the line of Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah. And what we'll try to also see is what comes out of this machloket as far as understandings of what those words mean when we say Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of a takeaway for all of us when we think about during this period, but in general, as to what this really means, what we're saying, and what it means as far as behaviorally, and how it can be a transformative experience in our lives. Before we do that, we're gonna start though with a different Yerushalmi, which is a Yerushalmi in Makot. And this Yerushalmi, if you open up your printed Yerushalmis, you won't see this Yerushalmi. At least you won't see the yellow line, the line that's highlighted. Well, they both look yellow on the screen, and on the computer, the top one is yellow, the bottom one is green. There's a little shade of a difference there. The top line one will not find in one's standard printed Yerushalmis, because the standard printed Yerushalmi was published from the lone surviving manuscript of the Yerushalmi, or at least of the full Yerushalmi. There was only one manuscript that survived from medieval times of the Talmud Yerushalmi, and that's the famed Leiden manuscript. And that was used when the Yerushalmi was first published in Venice in 1523. And as we know, when we we've seen in past discussions, when a scribe copies over a manuscript, they can easily make mistakes, and they can leave out passages. The source that they're working off of might be defective. So fortunately, in addition to this lone manuscript of the Yerushalmi, there's fragments of the Yerushalmi, sometimes individual masechtot that have survived in other manuscripts, sometimes fragments that have survived in the Cairo Geniza. And in this case of the Yerushalmi Makot, this line, which is going to be critical for us, didn't survive in the Leiden manuscript. It survived in this manuscript from the Cairo Geniza, and we've reconstructed in our Yerushalmi here. What we've tried to do is reconstruct the Yerushalmi based not only on the standard printed text, but also on all the all the other resources that we have available at our disposal. So, without further introductions, we'll take a look at this Yerushalmi. It's a fascinating Yerushalmi, and we'll discuss the question of how do we know that this Cairo Geniza fragment is correct rather than the Leiden or standard printings. Sha'alu la Torah, hachotei b'mahu onsho. Amra lahen, yavi korban v'yitkaper lo. They, whoever the they is, maybe it's the Malachim, maybe it's just the narrator, ask the Torah, what does one do if one sins? How do you deal with that situation? And the Torah says, simple. You bring a sacrifice and you'll get kapara. We'll discuss this a little more. We'll discuss the Torah's answer in a second. But first, let's read the other 4 answers that come up in this Yerushalmi. Sha'alu la-chochma, chotei mahu onsho. So now wisdom gets asked. And what's its answer? What do you do what does a sinner do? Amra lahem, chataim tiradif ra. Once you sin, it's lost cause. You're just going to continue. Avira, goreret avira would be the way we would probably formulate this in contemporary parlance. Once you do an avira, it just leads to more ra'ot, more avirot. Sha'alu la nevuah. Now we ask the prophecy, and in this case, the prophecy is perhaps another name for neviim. Chotei mahu onsho. Amra lahen, hanefesh hachoteit hitamut. It's kind of a little depressing, these last two answers. So wisdom says, once you sin, it's a lost cause. And I think we all know that we get into bad habits. There's certainly some truth to that. It becomes even more and more difficult to get out of it. But the prophecy says, forget about whether you're going to change or not. The only solution, or the only kapara, the onesh, is mavet. You sin, you die. So very, very strict attribute of justice here. And it's quoting a pasuk from Yechezkel. Right, if we click on that link, Yechezkel Yud Daled, Hanefesh hachotei titamut. So, hein kon nefashot li, heina kenefesh ha'avuch nefesh habein li, heina hanefesh hachotei titamut. But the truth is, the context from Yechezkel isn't so simple. But that's not. But anybody who wants to can take a look at Yechezkel Perek Yud Chet, which is one of the most interesting prakim for the mitzvah, as a source for the actions of Teshuvah. Maybe if we have time at the end, maybe we'll get back to it a little more. Sha'alu David, hachotei b'mahu onsho. Now this line is also, you see there's a note on it, it's from the Kitei Genizah, and David answers, Amar lahem yitamu chataim min haaretz. So we had the first.
What's it?
I'm sorry?
What's it?
Good question. And David of all people, wasn't he didn't lead such a simple life. So yitamu chataim min haaretz, and we know that there's other drashot that come up in Chazal. Yitamu chataim v'lo chotim. So it could be that maybe one can read this line of David in multiple ways. It could be that the one possible reading is yitamu chataim as if it's chotim. So David is talking about the sinner, because after all the question was hachotei b'mahu onsho. So it could be that David is saying He's wiped out. On the other hand, if he says that, then the contrast between David and the Nevuah isn't so simple. Right? Because they seem to be saying the same thing. And Nefesh HaChotei Tamut, and the other one's Yitamu in Haaretz. But it could be that there's a second possible reading here, that it's Yitamu Chata'im, if we would read this in context of other Mamarei Chazal, Yitamu Chata'im v'lo Chote'im. So then the hope is that the Chata'im, not necessarily the Chotei, then it becomes almost the exact opposite. And that might be a little more appropriate for David, who is, to some extent, in a paradigm of a Baal Teshuvah. Right? David says Chatati, and to some extent, it is Mikaper lo. But now we get to what our real foil here is. Sha'alu v'kudsha berichu. Now Hashem gets asked. Chotei mahu onsho. Amar lahen. Ya'aseh teshuvah v'yitkaper lo. So Kadosh Baruch Hu says, what should the Chotei do? He doesn't answer what the onish is. He says, Ya'aseh teshuvah v'yitkaper lo, and then we don't have to worry about an onish. So we have 5 approaches here, and 2 of them are much more optimistic, and 3 of them are, and another 2 are pessimistic, and David is a toss-up. But besides the fact that we have a whole bunch of different opinions here, and I guess we have, there's really Chokhmah and Nevuah and Torah, do they really have different opinions on this? So what is going on in this sugya? And particularly, we have the first and fifth opinion. One is the Torah, the other is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if you tell me that there's a difference between Nivuah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as to what a Navi might say and what a HaKadosh Baruch Hu might say, we could see that, right? A Navi, let's say Eliyahu, he's a Kanai, so he comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, punish them. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, you have to have mercy. Yonah, right? We can see a machloket, perhaps. It's a machloket, Rishonim, whether there really can be such a thing, between a Navi and a HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But to have a difference between the Torah and a HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I mean, the Torah is Dvar Hashem. So what does this mean? Sha'alu la Torah, and the Torah says, bring a korban. And then they ask the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, do Teshuvah. Well, which one is it? What's the relationship between them? And if they're the same, which could have been a theoretical possibility, but then why are they divided like this in the Yerushalmi? Anyone have a suggestion? What's the relationship between Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How can there be a dichotomy between those 2 things, which would seem to be part and parcel of the same thing?
You can't bring korban without doing teshuvah.
I'm sorry?
You can't bring a korban without doing teshuvah, so the Torah is one step more.
Okay, so we could view it maybe as a step process. We could view these 2 answers as part and parcel of the same answer, I guess. So I guess we'd probably be a little less bothered by it if they were sort of put together, right? But they're separated. If they were put together, so then maybe one's building on the other. So that's a little bit of a discomfort with that, but. Okay, there's differences in the order between the manuscripts also, so it could be that it's that's not such a terrible question. Torah should be tab and Torah should be peh. So how would that play out?
Well,
which one is which?
Is Torah should be tab.
Yeah.
The second one is Glasa.
Okay, I think it's a nice approach. We'll try to develop that in just 1 second. Yeah.
It questions the authenticity of the citation. It questions the authenticity of the citation.
Okay, so let's address that issue. Just so before anyone thinks that we have apikourses from the Geniza here or something like that. So this passage of Shalula Torah comes up not only in the Yerushalmi and the Geniza, but it comes up in Psikta de Rav Kahana. So it comes up in other midrashim. So it's that's one reason to know that it's authentic. And 2, it gets cited by the Rishonim, including Ramban. Ramban has a work called Ha'emunah B'Bitachon, and he cites this Yerushalmi like the Geniza. So he has the yellow passage. Okay, but let's try to develop which I think I think was a very interesting type of approach. That possibility of Torah shebichtav, Torah shebal peh. I may formulate it slightly differently, but let's give a little historical background. Using what we saw last week. We saw last week that when we talk about Teshuvah in the Torah, so it's very difficult to find a source for doing Teshuvah or an obligation to do Teshuvah. Because Teshuvah in the Torah comes only after Galut has happened. Once you're in exile, V'shav Hashem Elokecha Shvutecha V'richamecha, V'shavtad Hashem Elokecha, we have a dual process, a process of returning to each other. The lover and the Hashem and his beloved Am Yisrael are both returning to each other. After the Churban Beit HaMikdash, besides Bnei Yisrael going into Galut, there's also something else that disappears. What disappears? What is no longer available to us? Korbanot. The Beit HaMikdash. Once the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, even though maybe today we could bring a Korban Pesach, so we won't get into that issue. But nobody, for all practical purposes, nobody has brought Korbanot since the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. So until Churban Beit, this option of Sha'alu la Torah, Torah shebichtav, would have been a possibility. Yavi Korban v'yid kaperlo. That was a real possibility. After Churban Beit HaMikdash, there's suddenly a crisis. And we know about this crisis in terms of other mitzvot. In terms of mitzvot like, where else do we have questions of what to do after Churban Beit, where things were done in the Mikdash a certain way, and now comes along Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and has to reconstitute these mitzvot. Mitzvot like shofar, like lulav, like Yom Hanafat HaOmer, all of these, Yisur Chadash, all these mitzvot change the ikvot Churban Beit in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. In addition to some of those more practical hands-on mitzvot, we have the whole concept of how one does Teshuvah, how one can get kapara. The whole center, the whole focus of the Beit HaMikdash of bringing korbanot is no longer. This creates a certain crisis, and Chazal are attempting to deal with it. And I think this Yerushalmi reflects one of the attempts, or you can see some of the layers in it. Sha'alu la Torah is pre-Churban Beit. Sha'alu la Kudsha B'richu, you could formulate that as Torah Shebal Peh, or you could formulate it as HaKadosh Baruch Hu after Churban Beit HaMikdash is now, and part of what's happening after Churban Beit HaMikdash is the development of Torah Shebal Peh. So those really are very close to each other. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets asked, well now, after Churban Beit HaMikdash, Sha'alu la Torah, the Torah gave an answer, but that doesn't help us anymore. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says something can replace the Korban, and that is Teshuvah. Now, as to why that line got lost, so perhaps we could have, instead of the possibility that I think we should reject, that the line's not authentic, I think the line could have been taken out because it was no longer applicable, or because it created some sort of contradiction. Perhaps it was bothersome to have the Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu having a machloket with each other. Right? It sounds a little jarring. So this source from the Yerushalmi, the reason why I want to look at it, even though it's not directly relevant to Teshuvah, Tzedakah, is because it brings to the fore this issue of what happens after Korban Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the actual possible source for the line in our piyut, the first possible source. And that is the Bavli in Masechet Rosh Hashanah Tet Zayin Amud Bet. Ve'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Arba'at Devarim Mekarein Gezar Dino Shel Adam. Make it a little bigger. Eluhen, Tzedakah, Tze'akah, Shinui Hashem, V'shinui Ma'aseh. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, there are four things which can reverse an evil decree. The first one is tzedakah, which let's assume for right now means giving tzedakah giving charity, like most people would interpret it. Se'aka, crying out, shouting out, presumably to Hashem. Changing one's name, and changing one's actions. And then the Bible proceeds to give proof texts for each of these sources, for each of these four elements. Tzedakah dichtiv u'tzedakah tatzil mimavet, pasuk from Mishlei. So how do we know that tzedakah is koreh gzar dino, that tzedakah can help reverse the evil decree? So we have a pasuk explicitly, tzedakah saves from death. Se'aka dichtiv vayitzaku el Hashem batzar lahem umimitzukotihem yotzi'em. So they cried out to they'll cry out to Hashem. The mizmor that we now say on Yom Ha'atzmaut, this Shir Shal Yom, umimitzukotihem yotzi'em, and from their difficulties, from their tribulations, Hashem will take them out, redeem them. Shinui Hashem. Tichtiv sarai yishtecha lo tikrat shema sarai ki sarah shema. And then the very next pasuk, uchtiv uveirachti ota v'gam natati mimena lecha ben. So until then, Sarai was in Akara, was barren, and once she becomes Sarah, she goes from Sarai to Sarah, so Shinui Hashem, change of name, and the very next pasuk is, now she will be blessed, and she will be able to give birth to a son after 90 years. Shinui Ma'aseh, the fourth one, Dichtiv Vayar Ha'elokim et Ma'asehem, Uchtiv, the continuation of that pasuk, Vayinachem Ha'elokim al Hara'ah Asher Diber La'asot Lahem V'lo Asah. Pasuk from Yonah, pasuk by Nineveh, where Hashem sees their actions, and as a result, that transforms their decree, and Hashem no longer changes his mind about bringing the punishment that he was going to bring upon. So that's what we have here in the Bavli. And at first glance, there seems to be some correlation to our piyut, to the line of Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ma'avirin Droa Hagzerah. One of the elements, Tzedakah, is noted by that same name. Se'aka might be the equivalent of Tefillah. Shinui Hashem doesn't look so good for us. Shinui Ma'aseh could be Teshuvah. And in fact, Rashi, if we go down a little, Shinui Ma'aseh, Rashi here, Shav Meira'ato. So Shinui Ma'aseh is probably, we would all simply understand Shinui Ma'aseh means to stop doing the bad things that one is doing. The Ritva in the Shas here, so on the particular lines of the Gemara, you can see the Rishonim that are related and Achronim that are related to that particular line. So we can see the Ritva, late 13th, early 14th century Spain. Shinui Ma'aseh, Ritva here. Peresh Rashi, Shav Meira'ato. So he quotes Rashi, and then he says V'lo Nehira. He doesn't think that makes sense. Tehapshita. She'im eino shav midrachav kitovel v'sheretz biadohu. So the Ritva says, well, this is there's a difficulty in Rashi's approach, because what does it mean that if you do if you're shav meira'ato, if you stop doing your bad things, so then mekarina droag zerat. It's that's not something extra special that you're doing, returning from no longer continuing to do bad things. If you continue doing bad things, so we wouldn't even be having a conversation here. So the Ritva says no. Shinui Ma'aseh means a little bit more. It's another level, a level above just stopping doing the bad things that you were doing. V'hanachon she'afilu ma'asim shel rishut she'inam hagunim k'tzat hu mishaneh. Klomar shehu adam acher legamre. Now, there's a couple interesting things in the Ritva. The first thing is the Ritva has insight into human personality. He knows there's all sorts of things that by the letter of the law are okay, but the spirit of the law, if you don't care about being a naval birshut HaTorah, so yeah, maybe you could say Torah didn't say I couldn't do X, Y, or Z, but we all know that the Torah doesn't speak about every single case. The Torah gives us certain ethical guidelines, and we have to use a little bit of common sense also. The Ritva says it's those actions. If a person has done something bad and is going to get punished, and a person who wants to be korea gezar dino, the person has to go up a level. The second thing that the Ritva does here is he says, Klomar shehu adam acher legamre. What does it sound like the Ritva is combining here? He puts together the Shinui Hashem and Shinui Ma'aseh. Now, the Ritva had our Girsa in the Gemara because we can see that the previous passage has Shinui Hashem. But what the Ritva is doing is something that might be helpful for us, because if we combine Shinui Hashem and Shinui Ma'aseh, and we say that those are really part and parcel of the same procedure, a person becomes a totally different type of person, because even actions where you could have gotten away with, which weren't exactly weren't indictable, a person stops doing, so then it becomes a person of totally different character. And what question or what might that allow us to do using that line in the Ritva? So we have a little bit of a difficulty. If we want to use this passage of the Gemara as a source for Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ma'avirin et Ro'ah Gzeira, what's the obvious discomfort that we have? We have an order, but before order already is already Mahadrin. We have a number issue. The Rabbi Yitzchak said, "Arba'a dvarim mekarim gzar dino shel adam," and the piyut only counts 3 things. So if using this Ritva we combine Shinui Ma'aseh and Shinui Hashem, so then we can make them into 3 things, and we can say that there's a conservation of elements going on in the piyut, and Teshuvah really includes both. And then once we do that, then maybe we can also answer the order. Now, I'm not really saying this seriously on a pshat level, but on a drush level, one could say that if Teshuvah then is encompassing 2 different elements, so then we move it to the front of the line, and then we can answer all our questions. Now, that's the wrong answer, but that could be a possibility if one wants to force it. So that's what we have in Rashi and the Ritva. But we have other commentaries on this passage, and one of them explicitly makes the connection to our piyut. Rashi and the Ritva didn't do that, and it could be that they just didn't mention that because they weren't writing a perush on piyut here. They were writing a perush on the Gemara, or it could be that they realized that the Gemara was not the source for our piyut. But one of the early achronim, the Maharsha, which we have down here in the red, does comment, and if one wants to find out about the Maharsha when he lived, full name, so then there's a little eye icon on top of each one of the Parshanim, and one can click on that for biographical information. So the Maharsha who's living in the early 16th century, has a somewhat extended discussion of this passage from the Gemara, and let's take a look at what he says. So ve'elu hagimel yisadan hapayat. So meaning se'aka, tzedakah, and shinui ma'aseh, these 3, the paitan, when he says Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, ma'avirin et ro'ah hagzeira, he's referring to this Gemara. And the Maharsha seems to assume that the Bavli really is in fact the source for the piyut. Now, if the Bavli is the source for our piyut, so then he has to deal with the obvious question of what we do with Shinui Hashem. Now, we saw one possible approach in the Ritva, but that was already, we were reading a lot into the Ritva, and it didn't fully solve the problem. But let's see the Maharsha's approach. Aval Shinui Hashem v'Shinui Makom l'divrei Yesh Omrim. Later on, in the continuation of the Gemara, there's another possibility, Shinui Makom, from Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimolatzecha. So Avram is told that Ve'escha l'gar gadol v'avarechecha, your gzeira, your gzar din is going to change. By moving, by changing your location. Lo zachran hapaitan shehem gam kein ma'avirin hagzeira ki dekamar hacha. But the paitan didn't mention those two. Ulufum riyata ikalameimer bazeh. How can we explain this? The lo zachar hapaitan ela elu gimel roa hagzeira sheba lekapara hagzeira sheba bishvil chet. Ma she'en kein shinui Hashem b'shinui makom dilo ba'u l'shanot hagzeira sheba al chet. The Maharsha says there's a difference between the three of Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, we'll call them by the easier names that we're familiar with, and Shinui Hashem and Shinui Maaseh on one hand, and Shinui Hashem and Shinui Maaseh on the other hand. There's a fundamental distinction between them. What's the distinction? In the first, when we talk about Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, so we're talking about actions that relate to the sin that you did. One's doing Teshuvah about the sin. One's being tzoek to Hashem. One's doing Tefillah that Hashem should forgive us. One's doing Tzedakah to be mechaper on that sin. There's a direct relationship, at least in some of them. Some of them it's a little clearer, maybe. Maybe they can all be debated, but this is what the Maharsha said. As opposed to Shinui Hashem and Shinui Maaseh. If I change my name, if I make Aliyah or make Yeridah, what does that have to do with the fact that I stole from somebody? No connection. Another way of saying this, perhaps, is that Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah are much more fundamental actions that relate to a person changing something about their behavior. Shinui Hashem and Shinui Maaseh. So I changed my name on my Teudat Zehut. I changed my citizenship. So it doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily accompanied by a change of behavior. So I think one could see for a number of reasons a difference between the first three and the other two, and therefore the Paitan, when he's creating this majestic Unatan Tokev, can you imagine if he said Utshuvah, Utfilah, Tzedakah, Mavirin Netrag Zera, and also Shinui Hashem and Yeshomrim Av Shinui Maaseh. Can you imagine the Chazan, doing that? It would be kind of catastrophic, I think, to as far as what it would do to the piyut. Right, this would hardly be something of what we're all going to now get in Aliyah and be Kareshim Obi Yisrael, or give a different name, as if Chaz Hashem someone's ill or something like that when we do that. This is of course the source for that minhag. So this would seem very understandable why the Paitan would do like what the Maharsha said. Yeah.
But if he eliminates the shame and the maaseh, then where do you get Teshuvah? Because the Gemara you'd only have Tefillah and Tzedakah, whereas the previous the Ritva, at least he said the Teshuvah comes from the shame and maaseh. But where does the Maharsha get Teshuvah?
From maaseh.
From the maaseh.
Right. Right,
okay,
it's supposed to be Mashem and Makom. Did I say the word Maaseh by mistake?
I'm
sorry, I confused everyone.
So you're talking about Makom.
Let's try that, right.
Get rid of Makom and Shem.
And I apologize. Teshuvah, Tzedakah, Tzedakah on one hand, and the Shem and Makom on the other hand. I'm sorry, I got Chachamim zaru b'divreichem, because I create confusion. So the Maharsha now is able to use this Gemara by this distinction, which is a reasonably fundamental distinction, is now has a source for the Paitan, and what the Paitan. So according to the Maharsha, the Paitan is basically editing the Bavli, taking the parts that are more meaningful, the parts that are more fundamental, and creating our piyut. And one more point in the Maharsha, he says, how do we know that Shinui Hashem isn't connected to a chait? Teha Shinui Hashem misara yalif, v'Shinui Hamakom me Avraham. So the change of name and change of place are learned from Psukim by Avraham and Sarah. And it would be hard to say, we certainly wouldn't want to say, Devadai lav mishum chet tziva lishanot shem Sarah u'makom d'Abraham. We don't want to say that these were Rishaim, who the way they were doing Teshuvah on the chet is by doing shinui, change of name and change of place. Got it right. But rather, these two elements don't relate to kapara and chatzai.
But it just changes your muzzle. Doing this changes your muzzle. With Avram and Sarah,
Mazel.
we changed their muzzle, right?
Right.
And that's all we are aiming for.
Okay, so the Maharsha is basically taking this Gemara and saying that we're not just aiming to, and he's transforming the Gemara to some extent. We're not just aiming to get a technical save ourselves from punishment. What the Maharsha says is that we want to become better people, not just to avoid punishment, but because we want to be good. And that's really what Teshuvah is all about. Teshuvah is about changing your whole personality to come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not just evading punishment. So that's what I think the Maharsha is doing. Now, there was a contemporary of the Maharsha, in some ways better known contemporary, and that is the Maharal Miprag. The Maharal wrote a Perush on the Agadot of the Gemara, also Chidushei Agadot, but his most interesting treatment of this passage of the Gemara comes in a different work of his called the Netivot Olam. And there's some similarities between, perhaps there's a common denominator between the Maharsha and the Maharal. This is the Maharal that's known as the creator of the Golem, which never existed, but in the fabled creation of the Golem. So we're talking about early 16th, late 15th, early 16th century. That's when the Maharal is active, and the Maharal in his Netivot Olam speaks about this Gemara, and we're going to pick it up from the purple words here. Bidalecha. Bidalecha. First, what preceded that was a whole citation of Rabbi Yitzchak from the Gemara. Bidalecha, ki elu divarim re'uyim sheyiyu mishanim et hagezera. Ki ha'adam yesh bo arba'a chalakim. Shehem, haguf, v'hanefesh, v'hamamon. Asher gam kein nechshav kamo echad michalakav. Kamo she'yipayer kama pamim. And certainly for some people, their money is a very important part of them. כי הממון של אדם גם כן נחשב לחלק האדם, כמו שאמרו חכמים פעמים הרבה, הגוזל את חברו שווה פרוטה, כאילו נוטל את נפשו. ועוד אמרו הצדיקים חביב עליהם ממון שלהם יותר מגופם, even tzadikim care about their money. So the Maharal says there's three parts to a person. There's guf, nefesh, and mamon. I'm sorry?
It says ki adam yesh bo dalet chalakim.
Yeah. We'll get to. One second. We'll get to the fourth. So far, he's only talked about three. He's about to hit the fourth. And we're familiar with another place where Mammon comes in, into a drasha.
The Shema.
In Shema, right? V'atayit Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha. Now, pshat in the word me'odecha might certainly not be Mammon, but drashat Chazal is that's the Mammon of the Adam. So leiv, nefesh, and Mammon. And in fact, the Maharal is about to bring that. Ve'elu shlosha dvarim be'arnu eitzel ahavat Hashem yitarach. Tichtiv v'avta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha yem lamala. Omnam hariviyi. Okay, because we have people who are alert here. Might have tried to pull fast one on us. No. Hu asher kolel kulam. Ki elu shlosha dvarim him achalakim. Ha'adam kolelet shloshtan sheyesh bo haguf ve'hanefesh ve'hamamon. And then he compares it to a house where you have avanim, eitzim, and afar, and Beit counts as all three. So the shame of the Adam, the name of the person, that's the whole Adam in his totality. And then we have different parts of the person. We have the leiv, nefesh, and mamon. And now the Maharal does a very interesting conceptual lining up of our elements of Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah with the three elements of Guf, Nefesh, and Mamon. So one's obvious, right? Mamon and Tzedakah. So those are definitely going to line up. And what about the other two? So we're going to see. This can actually work both ways. But we'll take a look at what the Maharal says. Ki ha'masim hem leguf ha'adam kasher tzarich lasot ha'masim baguf. Kasher mishaneh letov chilek echad michalakav mevatel et ha'gzeira shenigzar al ha'adam. So the actions are for the guf ha'adam. So when you change shinui ma'aseh, when you change your actions for the better, whether it's the old actions that you're no longer doing or the extra actions that you're now taking on, so that's the change in actively through the body of the person. Tefillah hila nefesh shekach ne'emar eitzel tefillah va'eshpoch nafshi lifnei Elokein. You're pouring out your soul in front of Hashem. So, and tzedakah hu b'mamon shelo lefichach elu shlosha dvarim. I skipped a line there. Hey mitzad chelkei ha'adam v'shinui Hashem hu ha'kolel et shloshtan ki Hashem asher yikarei bo ha'adam kolel kol chelkei ha'adam. So now we have the Maharal says we have a beautiful lineup here of Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah. They're affecting different parts of our personality, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol me'otecha, or guf, nefesh, and mamon. And what happened to the missing fourth element of the Gemara, Shinui Hashem? That is all-inclusive, that includes everything, so it's not missing, but it's part and parcel of all three elements. Now, as opposed to the Ritva, where we said that maybe Shinui Hashem goes together with Shinui Ma'aseh, and as opposed to the Maharsha, what the Maharal shares with the Maharsha, of course, is that he's also apparently struggling to try to get this piyut, the Bavli, to be the source of this piyut, and he wants to create a distinction. The way they're both doing it is by creating a distinction between three of the elements and the fourth. Just while according to the Maharsha, that fourth element of Shinui Hashem and the Shinui Makom, the name and place, according to the Yesh Omrim, those elements the Maharsha reduces to trivial, right? Because they're not really related to Chet and Kapara. The Maharal makes them much more fundamental, that they're all inclusive. So those are two approaches to the source to how we can force the Bavli, compel the Bavli to be the source for our piyut of Utshuvah, Tefillah. But the Bavli isn't the be-all and end-all of Torah literature. For the early Achronim, the Bavli very much was the focus, and even in our day, still the Bavli, Daf Yomi for the Bavli is many, many times more popular than Daf Yomi for Yerushalmi. But there's a very important Yerushalmi that's relevant to our piyut, and we're going to take a look at that Yerushalmi. It's not in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, but rather in Masechet Ta'anit. Amar Rabbi Lazar. And the Yerushalmi frequently names that we're familiar with an aleph in the beginning. Names and words lose their aleph, don't have an aleph in the Galilean Aramaic of the Yerushalmi. Shlosha devarim mevatilin et hagezera kasha. Ve'elu hein tefillah u'tzedakah u'teshuvah. What else do you need? Here we have it. So the question we have to ask ourselves right away. So it was just translating. So three things are cancel the evil decree: tefillah, tzedakah, and shuvah. So perfect. Number one, we only have three elements, so that's what we want in our piyut. Number two, we have the elements that we want. The only little bitty thing here that we might wonder about is the order. So remember this the gun in the first scene that we saw last week. We'll come back to that. It's coming up. So in the Yerushalmi here, we seem to have a perfect match for our piyut. So the question that we're going to read the continuation of the Yerushalmi. That's very important also. But before we do that, so the question that should be bothering us all is, it's so obvious. Well, if it's so obvious, then why didn't the Maharsha and the Maharal bring the Yerushalmi as the source? Why did they bring the Bavli? So that was my first thought also. So maybe they didn't have the Yerushalmi, but the dating on the Yerushalmi. So had they lived 100 years earlier, that would have been a theoretical possibility, because in time of the Rishonim, not everyone had the Yerushalmi late, and we saw only one manuscript survived. But the Yerushalmi was published in 1523. So by the end of the 16th century, I think I may have mixed up my centuries before. By the end of the 16th century and early 17th century, when the Maharsha and the Maharal are living, so the Yerushalmi was readily available, and the Maharsha quotes the Yerushalmi all the time. So it's not that he didn't have Yerushalmi, but that's certainly something that one should consider. But even when you have the Yerushalmi, the assumption that everyone has is that, or that early Achronim certainly had, is that if you have a Yerushalmi and a Bavli and a Yerushalmi, so which one takes precedence? Which one would we follow? Of course, the Bavli, and in general, in Psak Halacha as well, the Bavli does wind up taking precedence for most poskim. So I think it's very possible that it wasn't that they weren't aware of this Yerushalmi. I would imagine they were very well aware of this Yerushalmi, but they wanted our piyut to work for the Bavli as well. We live in a very Bavli-centric Torah universe, so that I think is the real explanation for what's motivating the Maharsha and the Maharal. But historically, on the other hand, if one asks the question of what was the real historical source for our piyut, then it seems very likely that it was the Yerushalmi or the other Midrashim. There's also a Breshit Rabbah. We'll take a look quickly at the Breshit Rabbah. Rabbi Yudan B'Shem Rabbi Elazar. Let's blow that up. Rabbi Yudan B'Shem Rabbi Elazar Amar Shlosha Devarim Mevatelim Gezerot Ra'ot Ve'eluhem Tefillah Tzedakah Teshuvah. So almost identical language to the Yerushalmi. There's Tanchumas. There's a bunch of Mikarot in the Midrashim which all talk about three things rather than four things, and list Tefillah, Tzedakah, and Teshuvah. The order is a little different between the Mikarot, but very very close to each other. So the photo of the Machzorim that you showed us last week, right,
where it had Unasaniko, it had the piyut,
right,
were from 13th century,
late 13th century.
So when we say that the Yerushalmi wasn't published until 15. I mean, certainly Rishonim and Gaonim, they had manuscripts of Yerushalmi, correct?
For sure.
They knew Yerushalmi. Okay.
For sure.
Because historically, those
that was just a question.
Predate 15.
Right. That was just a question of what the Maharsha and the Maharal were working off, and we said that they also had Yerushalmi, but for sure the Rishonim.
So when you
had
say
Yerushalmi.
It was published, you mean that that it was published in total. The Yerushalmi. One publication of the entire Yerushalmi, as opposed to Gaonim and Rishonim that might have had bits and pieces of different manuscripts.
Right. Well, things couldn't be printed until printing press. So until 15th century, nobody could print anything. Right. So the first printing of the Yerushalmi. Right. So what the possibility would be that before printing, so it was rare. The Rishonim didn't all have, let's say, the Ramban. He gets a Yerushalmi on this Masechet when he comes to a certain place. So he didn't have a full Yerushalmi always at his disposal. These were rare books, rare manuscripts in time of Rishonim. So theoretically, one could have thought that maybe somebody would have or wouldn't have. But after the age of printing, it's inconceivable that the Maharal and the Maharsha wouldn't have had this Yerushalmi in front of them. That's all I was saying. And not to say the reverse, that it would definitely be that they didn't. But
okay,
I just want to push forward a little because we're going to run out of time. So the question is, as far as the Paitan himself, does it make more sense that the Paitan was working off the Bavli or off the Yerushalmi? Now here comes a interesting historical part of this question. because the source that was assumed to be the source until the last couple of decades, even when some of the Geniza material became more well known and available, was the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua in Germany in 13th century talks about Unetane Tokef being the work of Rabbi Amnon Mimagensa. And in many of the Machzorim it tells the story of Rabbi Amnon Mimagensa. So then we would be talking about a medieval work, and already at a time in which the Bavli was the center of the Torah universe. But we now know, because we have fragments from a Paitan whose name was Yanai, from the 7th century. We have parts of his piyutim that have survived, and we have a piyut, or parts of the piyut of Unetane Tokef, which is so close to our wording that centuries before Rabbi Amnon Magensa and his story with the Christian bishop who was trying to force him to convert, that the piyut of Unetane Tokef predates all of them, and its source is not Germany. Not where the Torah universe, where the center of the Torah universe was the Bavli, but rather Yanai in Eretz Yisrael. So once that becomes, the source becomes Eretz Yisrael and much older, before, and a place where the Bavli didn't have any primacy over the Yerushalmi, but the opposite, where Midrashim, Breshi Rabbah, Tanchum, Yerushalmi had at least as much weight, if not more, than the Bavli. So then it becomes pretty clear that from a historical perspective, the source for this piyut, in its initial form at least, was the Yerushalmi. But the Maharsha and the Maharal, they give us valuable insights to think about as well. Now, if we put the Bavli and the Yerushalmi side by side, so we'll see that there are a couple of other differences between the two sources. So we had the 4 and the 3. That was one obvious difference. We have an order difference. According to the Bavli, we have Tzedakah, Tze'akah, Shinui Hashem, Shinui Maseh. So Tzedakah, Tefillah in our terms, Tzedakah, Tefillah, and Shuvah. And the Yerushalmi has Tefillah, Tzedakah, and Shuvah. They both put Shuvah in the 3rd place. The question is whether Tefillah or Tzedakah, which one of those comes first. But then we also have a difference in the sources, the proof texts that they bring. We saw before the proof text of the Bavli. The Yerushalmi says, "Ushloshtan bepasuk echad, v'yikaneu ami asher nikra shemi alihem v'yitpalelu zot tefillah, v'yivakshu fanai zot tzedakah, kama de'at amar ani betzedek echezeh panecha, v'yashuvu midarcheihem hara'im zot shuvah." So this pasuk comes from Shlomo's prayer when he dedicates the Beit HaMikdash, and he says the Beit HaMikdash should be a place for people from all over the world, not even particularly Jews, but even non-Jews. But it will be a place where my nation, Am Yisrael, when they're Beit Sarah, they will be able to come to the Beit HaMikdash and they will be mitpalel, v'yitpalelu, v'yivakshu fanai. He says, is tzedakah, and there we need an extra jump to get us there, because v'yivakshu fanai certainly doesn't say tzedakah explicitly. So how do we get v'yivakshu fanai to mean tzedakah? So that's why we have an additional pasuk, ani b'tzedek echezeh panecha. Now, one can debate the meaning of that pasuk as well, but that's what the Yerushalmi needs it in this context. And then v'yashuvu midarcheim hara'im zot shuvah. Now that, of course, explains why the order in the Yerushalmi is Tefillah, Tzedakah, and Shuvah, because that's the order in which it presents the drasha. V'yitpalelu, Tefillah, v'yivakshu fanai zot Tzedakah, and v'yashuvu zot Shuvah. And if we look at those sources, then we see that there's a significant difference, perhaps, between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. The Bavli is learning each of those 3 or 4 or 5 elements from separate psukim. The Yerushalmi is learning them all from one pasuk. Now, it's much nicer in some ways to sew them all up together. But the nafkamina from that might be a question that I forget who raised last week. is whether one needs all three elements in order to be Korea Gizardino, in order to reverse the evil decree, or it's enough for each of the elements individually. From the Bavli's Limudim, so then one could easily say that each one of those on its own has special magical powers. Because each one has its own separate pasuk, there's a separate source for each one. For the Yerushalmi, though, one might argue that one needs the totality of those elements together. Okay, so we're out of time. So let's try to just bring this all together for just a takeaway message that I think we can all use for ourselves. We have the word Teshuvah and we spoke about whether Teshuvah, as we normally understand it, is a very specific set of actions, vidui, hakarat hachet. But in many of the sources in Tanakh, as well as in Chazal, Teshuvah seems to be much more fundamental than that. A return to Hashem, return to doing all mitzvot, a change in personality, a change in all of one's actions, a change of character. So that's a lot more than just mouthing Hashamnu bagadnu, v'anachnu v'avotenu chatanu, or having specific regret over one particular action. The term tzedakah is also a very interesting term. We tend to think of tzedakah as tzedakah, tithing. And I'm not criticizing the mitzvah. It's a wonderful, very, very important mitzvah that we all try to perform. And that seems to be the way the Bavli, when the Bavli talks about utzedakah tatzil mimavet, that seems the way the Bavli is understanding the word tzedakah. In the question of, as far as the Yerushalmi brings a source, ani b'tzedek echezef anecha. Now it's true that this source gets used as a source for giving tzedakah before davening. Ani b'tzedek echezef anecha, I give tzedakah and then I come to see Hashem, before I come to ask Hashem with my shopping list. Here's what I want. First we give tzedakah. But notice the word tzedek. Now, while tzedakah, it's true that we all naturally have an inclination to understand as tithing, as charity. The word tzedek is a much more general term, a different type of term: righteousness, justice. And in fact, the word tzedakah in the Torah is would probably be hard pressed to say that tzedakah means tithing in Torah or in Tanakh. And we have a phrase which combines the word tzedakah with the word mishpat u tzedakah. And some of the commentaries, particularly Rabbi Yosef Kara, a student of Rashi, says anytime tzedakah comes with mishpat, as well as many psukim where tzedakah comes separately, it doesn't mean giving charity, but rather an overall acting in justice in an appropriate fashion. We have these elements, and with tefillah as well. We have a perfunctory action of tefillah, and then we have what the real meaning of tefillah is a recognition that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is responsible for everything that goes on around us. Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. It's not just while we're davening, but it's a change in mindset, a change of character. So these three elements of teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, we can view them as a magical potion. We can view them as, well, we just have to tithe, we'll write a few checks, we'll come to shul, and Yamin Noraim, we'll say our tefillah, we'll say our viduyim, we'll do our beating on our chest, and the karin gzardino shel adam. And I'm sure there's good value to all of that. But we can also take teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah and view them as transformative. View them as actions which relate to every fiber of our being, relate to teshuvah not just as a repentance over a particular chet, but rather as a return to Hashem, a return to the totality of the Torah, of the Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim that Hashem commands us. We can tithe and write checks and be a Robin Hood and steal from this one to write checks to write checks to this one, or we can lead our lives in a way in which we try to live a just and righteous life in a way that ani b'tzedek. May we all be inscribed in the Sefer Chaim Tovim as individuals and as a nation, as part of all of Am Yisrael. May all of Am Yisrael have a Shana Tovah, a K'tivah v'chatima Tovah. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot v'Nechamot.